Greetings everyone and welcome to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry. In today's episode we're continuing on with our what is it again, Ronnie?
VCA 6.
VCA, that's it. I want to say VCD, but it's VCA version 6 series that we've been working on. And as you can see, joining us today is none other than our good friend Mr. Ronnie Wong. Ronnie, welcome back to the show, sir.
Well, thank you for having me back as we take a look at more of the VCA 6. Remember that stands for VMware Certified Associate. And it's in version 6. That's because there was actually original version 5 that they had out there. And this particular exam is actually designed to help you to feel confident, of course, about some of the VMware technologies that you're actually going to be using, especially if you get into data center virtualization. So in a previous episode, right, we've already taken a look at some of the fundamental concepts of virtualization, and we're actually doing a little bit of review. And we ended that particular series by talking about one of the things that we can actually think about virtualizing is, as far as a benefit goes, is to move into the realm of what we call data center virtualization. So that's where we want to pick up, is that idea of data center virtualization, and to take a look at that and why is that concept needed as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look on my screen, and this will help us to get started too. So what I've done is I've created a small drawing of a data center. I probably took a little bit more time on this than I should have here, but I started, you know, it's just one of those things. You start off and then it's like, oh, I want to add this in there, I want to add this, and all of a sudden when I was done, I was like, man, I took more time on that than I should have. But when you start taking a look at it, remember that data center virtualization then, okay? When we started talking about the idea of just regular virtualization, we were pretty much saying one PC, one server, and then you can, of course, go to multiple servers when you do that. But when you talk about data center virtualization, well, now you're actually taking a look at more, right? So when we take a look at the idea of a data center, right, we're actually talking about the conglomeration of multiple technologies together, okay? We may have servers that still run the applications that we need, the services that we need, that respond to everything that we actually have, you know, out there that everybody in our network needs to get access to, okay? At the same time, we also may have different storage devices. And storage, of course, has become a little bit more complicated over the years as well. We've moved from hard drives that are just on those servers themselves to NASs, SANs, direct attached storage, iSCSI, fiber channel over Ethernet. Jiminy, I mean, you keep naming it, and every time you go into a different data center, you actually see where people are, oh no, we used that last year, and now we've changed this year, and you're like, wait a minute, I just got used to that technology, and it continues to change and evolve as well. And of course you have security, you have networking devices, routers and switches and everything. When I think about the idea of managing a data center, and I didn't even include in the internet connection, right? The actual connection out to WANs and stuff like that. I mean, there's a ton of different things in here, okay? Now, when we start taking a look at the management side of all this stuff, it can become a little bit more overwhelming, right? So this is where inside of your data center, I'm saying data center, data center or data center, whatever you want to call it. Inside of your data center, you might have specializations, right? You might have networking folks, okay? They absolutely deal with the routers and the switches, ensuring that everything goes on the way that we need to. We verify that technology is up to date. We have configurations. So let's say that those might be like people like Cisco folks that may come in and help us to manage that. We may also, of course, have some security specialists that comes in and deals with our firewall and, of course, all the security settings that we have to take in mind. We may, of course, have Microsoft experts that deal with Active Directory and managing networks, and then storage appliance guys that really know how to deal with this idea of the storage network. And then, of course, you have a facilities manager that knows how to deal with all that. When it comes down to it, in the business sense of the world, right, when it comes down to a single business doing this, this is in the business terms that we have to know about for the VMware 6 exam here, is what you call a cost center, okay? Everything about this screams cost, right, okay? You spend a lot of money on the servers, cost, okay? You buy the technology that hooks them together, the switches, cost, the cabling, cost, the air conditioning, the cost, you name it. This is what they call a cost center. Now, just when you go, all right, that's done, well, now, remember we talked about the supporting technologies behind it, right? The experts like Daniel and of course me, no, I'm joking. The experts like Daniel, you know, they come in and they also cost to maintain, right? Maintenance of these things is of utmost importance to big organizations. Now, Daniel worked for a huge insurance company. Daniel, maintenance on servers?
Big time, right? When Ronnie says costs, he's not kidding around. You don't forget warranties, buying new warranties. Don't forget backing all that up. I got to have a tape system to make sure all that is making, if something happens, God forbid, I can run to my tape and restore. There's a lot of infrastructure that goes along in putting this together. Not even to mention the biggest one we tend to forget, it takes electricity to run these things. You got to plug it into the wall somewhere so it gets power. And when you've got a rack of 200 servers, guess how much power that's taking up? A lot. But that's where one of the main benefits, and I'm sure we'll get into that, of virtualization.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we don't figure out, right? If we're used to working, like I am, you know, a small guy that ended up working in small LAN networks, you really don't understand the overall impact of a data center until you start breaking it down and realizing, just like Daniel has, because he's worked in a bigger center, is realize how much cost there is involved in just the idea of servers being in a single room and all the stuff that it actually takes just to power them on, to keep them running 24 hours a day. It takes a lot there. So the reason why this is important is we want to actually make sure that we focus in on the need then for data center virtualization, okay? So when we actually start thinking about that, it really breaks down into multiple areas, and we're going to break these down again. So let me see if I can focus in on this just a little bit here when we do this. Okay, so I'm going to just try and not give everybody seasickness here as I'm moving my screen around. When we start taking a look at some of the things that we have to deal with, okay, one of the big things overwhelmingly that every center has to deal with is what was called an infrastructure sprawl. Now, I want you to make sure that you focus in on that terminology. Most of us don't think about the term sprawl, but this actually happens inside of data centers and even happens in virtualization land as well, okay? But when it comes down to it, it's just like the data center that I just showed you here, right? The very fact is, as this company continues to grow, there's going to be what? More servers, okay? And if we actually start another rack, there's probably going to be more switches that actually get attached to that, and maybe even upgraded switches in between at the distribution layer, and maybe even more at the DMZ layer. As you start actually thinking about it, what ends up happening is more and more, you actually get more infrastructure, and the cost never goes down, okay? And that's what they mean by infrastructure sprawl, is that every time you take a look at it, there's more stuff that actually appears, and there doesn't seem to be a way to actually get rid of anything, right? And so we've actually had that situation happen, and it can happen even inside, like I said, of the virtualization world sometimes, where all of a sudden you're like, why do we have 46 virtual machines running, you know, and nobody actually claims these virtual machines. They go, I don't know what that's for, it's just there. And you're like, well, okay, what's it there for? And after a while, you start shutting them down.
Well, I log into this virtual machine so that I can remote desktop into that virtual machine. Why don't you just remote desktop directly? Because that's not the way we do it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that happens a lot.
Yeah, and you start seeing that, especially with hardware, that right at the beginning, that's one of the things that we actually think about here, is the very fact is that a lot of the budget, okay, that we have in terms of maintenance has to do with what we call that infrastructure sprawl idea. And the reason for that sprawl that ends up happening sometimes really has to do with what we call these different servers, right? So most of the server machines that we base ourselves around, the CPU is what we call an x86 CPU. And what does that mean? That means it was designed to actually run one operating system on that particular piece of hardware, and that was pretty much it. You know, it wasn't designed for virtualization, and that's the idea. So every time you need a new service, you tend to add a different server. You tend to add in more infrastructure into the environment. Okay. Now, when stuff like that happens, then you also, of course, have expenses that also go on, and so when you start taking a look at things, one of the big expenses is what we talked about right here at the beginning. Now, here's again terminology that you need to be familiar with, or because I was joking with Daniel about it before class, before the show here, is that, Daniel, when was the last time you actually heard me talk about capital expenditures and operational expenditures? I don't use this terminology every day, do I, Daniel?
That's in Ronnie's daily vocabulary. He loves those words. No, of course not. We don't use these terms, especially as tech people, right? We're tech people. We make servers run. We make computers run. We're not all about. But when you get into the data center, look, I can't even do it. Yeah. Data center level environment, these things do start become a part of you, because you have to figure, we don't have infinite amounts of money. We don't have the ability to just build an environment as we see fit. We have to stick with a budget, and that's when words like this do start creeping into our vocabulary. So this is kind of why they want you to see how this can benefit you monetarily, which is normally where people start really going, oh, okay, well, tell me more about this wonderful, exciting device that you have for me. So that's why we have to kind of bring it into our vocabulary.
It really is. It's one of these things that you'll find out, especially as you get toward the exam. You got to know their vocabulary, got to know the language. VMware likes using these languages because, well, it actually does hit the impact on the decision maker, and that's what it comes down to, is that when you're making decisions and whether or not you're going to do this or that, most of the time where you grab people's attention that are decision makers, and when you start talking about, well, what's your initial layout to this data center here, as far as the cost goes, and it's usually pretty high. Okay, so that front end, right, of buying the equipment that you need to form your own first data center based on your business need, it's what we call the capital expenditure at this point, okay, or capital expenses. It's usually very, very high, is what we also talk about. And then what we were mentioning earlier as well is that most of the actual things that go on as far as the human resource side of things is also what we call the idea of operational expenses as well, okay? The major cost in data centers on operational expenses is due to operational expenses for maintenance more than anything else that we tend to do. So when they start talking about this, they usually mention a figure, about 70% of your operational expense for your data center has to deal with maintenance. Now imagine that. You're not talking about innovating something new. You're not talking about testing and development. You're not talking about developing a business arm. You're just talking about maintaining that data center, and that could actually be 70% of your time, of your money, of every bit of your effort. Well, that means that you only have 30% to think about innovation and to think about reducing costs, to think about doing all these others. Most of the time we're saying, we just need to make sure that these things are up and running because we are a 24-hour-a-day shop. We can't afford to let anything go down. So the idea of these expenditures are really heavy. And so when you start thinking about it more and more, that's why we actually want to start thinking about data center virtualization. And we're going to get into this a little bit more later on, but that's the initial idea, is that it's very expensive to run a physical data center. Okay? The other thing, of course, is now when we start talking about availability. Okay? Now, when we start taking a look at availability, this is when applications need to be up and running regardless of what happens to our data centers. And that's why we have redundancies, that's why we have disaster recovery centers, that's why we have a lot of stuff that we have going on. But in a physical data center, you may have hardware limitations, right? The very fact is that piece of hardware may be the only one that's still working. And the only reason why you actually notice it is it went down, okay? You didn't have enough time to actually check on everything, and so you don't know if you have the availability that you need, and that could be it as well. Also, the idea of the time it takes to restart an application that has to come back up. That may actually cost you time in terms of business, there are companies that absolutely boil it down to like, here's how much it costs each hour to run. Here's how much it costs each quarter hour to run in minutes. They actually know that if it's down, it's costing them this much money, how much money they're actually losing as they're down. And so a lot of times in the physical sense, right, what if we do have a piece of hardware that is about to fail and go, we think it'll hold one more day, and it doesn't hold one more day, and then you're down. Well, that means availability also is a big reason, because data centers, as far as the virtualization side goes, there's technology there that can help you actually be just about 100% available all the time, okay? And of course, the idea of disaster recovery is a big one. And so this is where you see the terminology again. The business continuity. I don't even remember last time I actually used the term business continuity except in security types of venues overall, but we actually worry about things like this as well. And somebody operating a data center, it's also a big one. Disaster recovery is also a technology that we also have to actually worry about, and which is a very expensive part of a data center, right?
Oh yeah, you got to make sure that if your data, I always try to tell people, how much is your data worth to you, right? If you lost everything today, if your website went down or your company records were lost, what would that cost you in dollars, right? It would cost a lot. If you're a web-driven company, it costs you just about everything. You'd be losing all those days' profits for as long as you were down, right? So keeping that business continuity, making sure that everything is working according to plan, is something that is a high priority for just about anybody, especially at the executive level. I don't care if it's a small business or a large business. Somebody's running the stinking company, and they care whether or not data is being lost and profits are being lost. You're in business to make money, and it's nothing bad. Right? It's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. And let's do everything we can to make sure that that is happening. When we use virtualization, it helps us have that business continuity. It helps us keep that uptime as high as possible because we have a lot less points of failure.
We really do. And the other thing that we also have, of course, is the way that it tends to work, since you actually mentioned a little bit earlier, the idea of a cloud infrastructure is what you're building, which means we can actually have these ideas of the disaster recovery be anywhere. And it doesn't really matter as long as we actually have access to them. And so we have that ability as well. Also, limited productivity. Remember that a lot of the things that we do inside of a regular physical data center has to do with management tasks more than stuff that we really might need to get to that can help further our business, as well as maintenance. So that's a little bit repetitive, but it actually does work. And then, of course, there may be limited responsiveness as well. Now, in terms of limited responsiveness, this is where we get into the growing side of businesses. The very fact is we can actually have businesses scale out and scale up, right? Scale up to meet the business demand that we have, scale out to actually increase the footprint that we have in terms of the marketplace that we have. Most of the time, companies may fail at this, and why? CapEx, very expensive, right? And then as soon as CapEx is done, you actually have operational expenses, so you might realize something. You might be able to actually expand, but not at the rate that you need to keep up with the marketplace, because you just don't have enough capital there to help you out. The same thing with scaling up to meet even more orders at the same time. You may actually go, look, I need to order 5 more servers tomorrow. And they go, we can't build them by tomorrow and get them out to you. And now, it actually delays a little bit. So you may end up finding out that on the physical side, there is a limited responsiveness in terms of scalability. And even in the scalability side, right, with what was the term that I used here? The idea of scaling out and scaling up. Even with that, right, it's fairly slow when you start doing that. And also the other thing is that it may actually not be time sensitive. In other words, you may not be able to respond as quickly as you'd like to because you just didn't notice it. And why? Most of us are just happy that the stuff works, okay? That we're like, hey, it's working, and then tomorrow you get an extra 15,000 orders. You're like, oh, yeah, that wasn't expected. And things like that you don't think of. I know I didn't think about it. But when we actually got into IT Pro TV and we started realizing, like, the very fact is that we're a growing company, that, hey, maybe that one web server is not enough, and so you bring up 2 and go, well, maybe we need 3, and then all of a sudden in 30 minutes, 4. Well, how do you actually respond to that? You can't just stop every 15, 20 minutes going, oh, I guess I better bring up another server. I guess I better bring up another server. Well, the way that we do it is that we use a cloud-based technology that says, look, when more demand, we spin up servers automatically for you. Well, the same thing here. If you have physical servers, you can't just do that and go, oh, just bring another one online and let it come up. But in a virtualized environment, is that possible? Heck yeah, stuff like that is possible. So that's where we start talking about the need for the data center virtualization technology is pretty much out there. And we want to make sure that we have that in front of us as well, okay? So when it comes down then to the idea of virtualization for data centers, well, what is it that we can virtualize? Okay, well, when we take a look, okay, we can virtualize servers. We've already talked about this as well. VMs are pretty much the key here. And what we're trying to do, remember, is actually the idea of control what we call server sprawl as much as possible. So instead of having that single utilization, what we want to do is be able to run multiple VMs on one physical host. And that actually allows us to actually get better utilization out of that one install instead. And now we're actually doing power consumption because we can run less machines, okay, and actually have more servers running on that one machine and actually utilizing it better. Well, that's a great thing all around. Most people in a server environment would love to actually say that we're actually getting the use of 80, 90, maybe even 100% of our server out there, rather than saying, yeah, I know I've got 8 gigs on it, but DHCP is only using 1.5 gigs. I mean, that kind of stuff, you're like, why did you actually need a server that big? Well, that's the smallest one that they sold. Well, you tend to have to go with it. So that's what you actually see. So VMs are really kind of the heart behind what we can, is really the idea of virtualization. But beyond that, we of course can actually talk about the idea of storage here, okay? Now, unlike our traditional storage in terms of local storage as far as hard drives go, we can still use that, but when we start talking about virtualizing, can I virtualize the storage on my network? You better believe it. In data center virtualization, you can actually take even different types of storage devices and essentially virtualize them. Now remember what we talked about in terms of what virtualization means. We take the capacities of those and we essentially represent them in software, and then the software, the VMware software, can actually utilize and manage that however they want to. So regardless of whether you have NASs and SANs and iSCSI devices connected in, well, in terms of the way that you're actually going to see it in the virtualization world, is that it just looks like one big resource capacity pool, and it can actually utilize it however it wants to. So it can turn that around for everything, and that way you're not saying, well, is that technology going to meld with this one? Is that going to actually work with this one? Well, if it's software, it's software. And it actually says, oh, let me resource assign it this way as just a storage thing, and it can do it. Can you utilize all this technology? You better believe it. The stuff that we actually are going to take a look at in terms of VMware, since that's what our focus is, VMware centric, we're going to see that VMware actually allows us to connect to all these devices, and it says, it's storage. I don't care whether it's SAN, whether it's NAS, whether it's iSCSI, it's storage, and let me handle the way that you want to actually distribute that out, and we'll do it. Nice thing about this type of storage, remember that what we're really talking about a lot of times, these are devices that stand on their own, not dependent upon some other machine standing out there as well. So we're going to see that there's technology that helps us to virtualize this. So not only do we have the idea of servers and storage, but even networking we can actually end up doing. So here I have an example of routers and switches. Even inside of that virtualization management technology for data centers, you're going to see that even all this stuff can actually be virtualized. There's even what they call a virtual wire. Okay? And that just means it's in software. You just say, I'm connecting to this device, I'm connecting to this device. Do I have to actually physically go and plug it in? No. Okay? But inside of that software, you can do it. Okay? The nice thing about virtualizing the software is that it does help to eliminate a lot of clutter. Imagine, and actually I can tell Daniel, our server closet here, I worked in it from the very beginning, and it just, over time, right? Any server closet, if it's not managed daily, you're going to end up seeing what? Spaghetti wire everywhere.
Oh, they look crazy, right? I've been in plenty of data centers, and just about every one you go into, they look like some madman is in there just plugging cables in at random. And you're like, there's no way any of this works. But it does, because it tends to grow. You start off, everything looks beautiful, it's nice and organized, and after 6 months, it just looks like spaghetti.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that we want to get rid of as well. The ability to say, hey, look, we're reducing the number of cables in between devices, which you do have to buy, and then you have to actually be able to manage, you have to be able to run, you have to, I mean, you name it. There's a ton of different things dealing with that, as well as the switching that's actually involved too. Now, the nice thing about virtualizing things like switching is that there's actually different ways that you can actually do this. They literally can pull together the networking resources again and actually create what they call like a distributed switch. Multiple switches that, again, they can actually say, well, let me just reassign it how I want to reassign it and make it work the way that I need to make it work. It is amazing about how much more control that you can have. Now, you might be saying, well, do I really need that? Well, it depends on, what you really need. But overall, though, you don't need another specialist to do it. You need somebody that understands VMware, in their management capabilities. But it means you really don't have to go out and hire that Cisco expert if you don't want to come in and help you out a lot of times, if you can also trust that it's actually going to be out there. And of course, lastly, there's a couple of other things then at the end user side that you're going to see, or that they'll never notice, which is also good too. Okay? Remember that regular desktop computers, right? Usually companies end up replacing them on a life cycle basis, like every 3 years or so. I know the Department of Defense. It doesn't matter if that computer's been sitting there for 2 years, nobody's been sitting at it, they'll replace it in that third year. They just like, yeah, it's gone. And so every 3 years they get new one. Now, not every company will do that, but companies that do that, what do they realize? Individual PCs, right? They're going to continue to actually have better processors, more RAM, more storage, which means cost is going to continue to actually rise at some point here. And so everybody actually has stuff like that, but the ones that don't, Okay, what ends up happening is newer applications demand higher resources. Well, how do you deal with stuff like that? Well, you end up buying people new PCs after you bought this new application. Well, instead, right, being able to virtualize what we call desktops turns us into more of a terminal server environment, which is actually a good thing, but allows people to have their own individual desktops. It's virtualized. The nice thing about the virtualization is that that desktop believes what? It's running on a server hardware. Okay, it's got the quad core with processor in it, and it's got 2 gigs of RAM every single machine, whatever you actually want, right? Being able to do that ensures that that application is going to run at the efficiency that it believes it needs to run at. It's going to be able to do that very well.
And Ronnie, I've actually used this to leverage to get rid of viruses. My users, they will download a virus. They love to get malware onto their computers. So what we did was we said, well, you know what? You're going to log into these thin terminals and you'll get a virtualized desktop. And every time you log in, it gives you just your business applications. So you can download every virus known to man. As soon as you reboot, you get a clean slate. Everything's gone. We don't have to worry about anything. Virus cleanup becomes a thing of the past.
It really is kind of amazing here when you start thinking about some of the things that it can do. And then, of course, just regular applications that are also out there, just like what Daniel was talking about. Ensures that the application runs at the performance level that's needed. Ensures that people actually have the desktop environment that they need without really having to worry about too much of whether or not their physical hardware can handle it and whatever we have in place. So when you start taking that, that's actually what you can virtualize in the world of data center virtualization. Now, when you start saying, well, how the heck do we do that? Well, there's a few products that we are going to become more and more familiar with in the realm of VMware. I just want to make sure that I have actually white text on a black background to help us out here. Okay, so VMware. Let's talk about just a few, and we're just going to mention them now because we're going to go through these, so I just want to make sure that I list them out for us. VMware, I'll call it technologies, that we're going to be familiar with here for DCV, or DVC. Okay, so we'll go ahead and talk about them. The first one, of course, is going to be the basic hypervisor, and it's called the ESXi hypervisor. Oh, well, maybe it is, if I can actually spell it instead of deleting it out there. Hypervisor, okay? So this is the basic one that allows us to essentially create VMs, okay, is what we have the ability to do. And so this hypervisor is one we're going to get into a little bit later on, but we'll show a little bit of it. So here is the basic technology that everything is built off of as far as the virtualization goes, okay? Now the other thing that we also are going to become a little bit more familiar with is kind of the heart and center of all the management stuff, and it's called vCenter Server. Okay, so this is what actually allows us to start managing, well, things like the actual servers that are on ESX. Okay, it will also give us the ability to manage all those other things that we talked about in data center virtualization as well. The resources, the networking, and stuff like that. This is kind of the heart and center of what we take a look at. So it's actually kind of the interface between the hypervisor and also us as well. Okay, so we're actually going to see that one just briefly here. Okay, but how do we manage that particular piece there too? Okay, well, really what we're going to be focusing the majority of our time in is going to be kind of the main product here, which is going to be VMware vSphere, okay, 6.0. Okay, and this is kind of the latest edition. That's why the exam focus itself is called VCA 6. It's because it focuses in on vSphere. vSphere is a suite of technologies that allow us to actually send command messages through to the vCenter, which then can, of course, influence the hypervisor and actually manage all these other components. This is the largest component that we will tend to deal with, which is going to be right here. So the main focus of what we'll be doing, pretty much for the remainder of the shows is really going to focus in on getting more familiar with vSphere and its particular applications that we'll also see. And then we'll also take a look at something that is called vRealize Suite. Now, you may, if you've actually been familiar with VMware for a while, this is actually the newer form of what they called vCenter Ops operations. Okay, so if you actually heard the term vCenter operations, they've now changed it to vRealize. This is actually more of the direct way that it actually does kind of integrate the things that we really want to do. And so a lot of the operations management comes through here in the vRealize suite, and there's of course different editions of this. And you'll see the same thing with vSphere. There's a standard, there's an enterprise, there's an enterprise plus, and we'll get access all into everything else that we have available there. But when it comes down to it, that's pretty much the actual technology that we're going to take a look at. We'll really spend the majority of our time here in vSphere 6, and we'll probably spend a little bit of time taking a look at the vRealize suite. But there's actually other things that you actually see inside of vSphere. You'll see that there's product management types of services that are out there, resource management, schedulers, you name it, storage management, vMotion. There's a ton of different things that this series is going to take us through, at least being able to understand what they do and what they're going to focus in on. So the good thing is we've actually gone through a lot of the fundamentals here as far as the very beginnings, and that means that we're actually going to be ready as we actually move on through a new episode here. We'll probably jump right into some of these different ones, take a look at them much closer, is what we'll do.
Ronnie, it's exciting to play around with new technologies, and I'm excited to see what we got coming up in a more ESX or more VMware. VMware's got some really cool products. I've worked with them for quite some time, quite a few years now, and they never fail to impress me with the stuff that they throw out there. So I can't wait to see what you got on deck for us and to learn a little bit more about how virtualization can help us in our environments. Ronnie, is there anything else that we need to add to this episode before we wrap it up?
Not really, right? The very fact is this finishes up kind of the review and hopefully sets us up for what you're actually going to be seeing and what you're going to need to be focusing in on as you prepare for the exam. The first two episodes, if you now have actually said, I don't know if I really need them, that's fine if you're familiar with virtualization technology. But the very fact is, review is always a good thing. And some of the terminology in there, make sure you pay attention to terminology. If you know about it and you go, I've never used that term before, there's a reason why we're mentioning it. So pay attention to terminology if you're familiar with it, because we're actually going to start putting a V in front of everything that we actually end up doing here for this episode. But you'll see, we'll go over a high-level view of it, and we'll show what we can show you, so that way you have at least a little bit of familiarity with the interface of what you'll see. And we'll talk, of course, about what the features are and the benefits to using it and why we would choose to use that technology. So we're going to be seeing all that in the next few episodes.
All right, Ronnie, thanks for the VMware education so far. We are definitely going to be on the edge of our seats when it comes to the rest of what you have to show for us. That being said, we have wrapped up this great episode. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it, maybe learned a little something, and we'll see you in the next episode. As for this one, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we'll see you next time.